Welcome to This Week Health Events, where we amplify great thinking with interviews from the floor. The floor happens to be my home office this week, but the interviews are going to go on. Special thanks to our channel sponsors, Starbridge Advisors, Health Lyrics, Galen Healthcare, VMware, and ProTalent Advisors for choosing to invest in our show and the next generation of health IT leaders. My name is Bill Russell, Healthcare CIO coach and creator of This Week in Health IT, a set of podcasts, videos, and collaboration events dedicated to that purpose of developing the next generation of health leaders. We're going to go on the record that today, right now, with Dr. Don Rucker, the National Coordinator for Health IT for the ONC. Appreciate him coming on the show. A lot going on right now. We cover all things 21st Century Cures Act, as well as the final rule, which just came down on interoperability. So hope you enjoy. Dr. Don Rucker, National Coordinator for Health IT for the ONC. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's always great talking with you, Bill.
Well, I appreciate it. The proposed final rule coming out this week. This is from where I sit, having been in healthcare and you as well for many years, and seeing all the challenges since we rolled out the EHRs and the interoperability and all the challenges people have had still getting their medical record, the innovators trying to tap into the medical record and provide value. This appears to me to be a pretty seismic event within healthcare and healthcare IT. Is that how you guys are viewing this?
Yes, I think that is a fair statement. So the challenge has been, historically, it has been largely technical, right? So historically, I started in the day of, serial ports on computers, and most of your audience probably doesn't even know what that is. And parallel ports on computers, and most of your audience probably doesn't know what that is. But over the last 35 years, really 40 years, we've gotten a lot better. And so, if you look, compare it to, let's say in the 80s, in the 80s, we had the computer science, the algorithms we had, but we didn't have the compute power. We didn't have the data really to compute on, and we certainly didn't have the networks to share that data or make it interoperable. So applications were really, almost by definition, standalone activities. In the 90s, you started seeing some of the client-server type of approaches. But today, we have, for the most part, in most of the country, widespread broadband. And of course, with the EHRs now being almost totally electronic, we have the data and we have the compute power. So now I think what's been missing is a little bit of the will and the business case, really, as much as anything else, right? Because obviously the rules are more geared to addressing behaviors rather than inventing new technology. And the challenge has been, from a behavioral point of view, that in this third-party world, with lots of cross-subsidizations over all the decades, we have created incentives that are very much, I won't say they're anti-consumer, but they really ignore the consumer, right? We don't have, as consumers, the kind of choice that we have in the rest of our commercial lives, because everything in healthcare has been abrogated to various third-party decisions, so the payers, providers, the government, as opposed to having a one-to-one between the patients and providers, with maybe the insurers as catastrophic insurance, and questions of equity done through a similar kind of mechanism. We have made almost first dollar. I know people have deductibles and copays, but from an economics point of view, we have made almost first dollar go through the hands of third parties, right? One way or the other, whether it's calculation or deductible. Obviously, that world, the incentives that we have created and that people respond to have led to very consolidated delivery systems, right? The basic how to be a successful CEO in healthcare is really a buy as many hospitals, merge as much of the business as you can to be a price setter to payers. Well, in that kind of a world, your concern is not interoperability and a seamless consumer experience. It is having, to prevent leakage. So all of a sudden now, the business case for sharing has to really come from the public sector. It really has to come from rulemaking, from patients, from employers to say, wait a minute, we're left out of this game and this equation, and we want to have smooth, functioning access to our data. So we want data in public ways that we can access, and that has been the component that has really been missing, and that's the component that the Cures Act and our rule put into place.
Yeah, so that is a good foundation for the why. I'd like to walk through a handful of things. So the interoperability technology, the business models, the protection of intellectual property, which is one of the things that this really helps with, the data. So we're going to talk a little bit about USCDI and the foundation for that. And then the behaviors. We'll come back to the behaviors because we still have to, we fundamentally have to address those things. I've found this, as the more I keep looking at this, this is not thrown together. This is very well thought out over many years. This has been in the works for a while. So the technology is based on APIs, based on FHIR, version 4 of FHIR. Their certification body, the HL7 certification body, is going to maintain those APIs. So we're going to have a fundamental framework that most developers understand, most EHR providers understand, and a way to connect these things. So talk a little bit about the interoperability technology, and then we'll move on to some of the other things.
Yeah, looking at the technology stack, that has really evolved in part and parcel over the years. I think probably the biggest advance, the two biggest advances, I would say, in the technology, and they're really software, right? Because we're using TCP/IP and the internet and all of that provision. But one is the concept of a RESTFUL API. So RESTFUL is a combination of an acronym and a modifier. So the acronym is the capital letters REST, and then the modifier is the FUL. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer. And what that really says is simply, rather than sending over the data with, intermixed with instructions, it really says, send the data over as just a pile of data, a much simpler thing to do. And then, the instructions can be done on site. That has combined with a very plain texty representation of data called JSON, which is even more elegant than XML. I mean, XML was a pretty profound standard and let lots of things happen, the angle brackets that we're used to. But the JavaScript object notation, the JSON, and then there's a gentleman named Graham Grieve from Australia who started putting that into a format for healthcare called FHIR, which stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and as one might imagine, is the C for many puns, of which ONC has been guilty of several as well. But that combination of things is that is what drives most of the internet. So developers who aren't steeped in some of the prior healthcare specific technologies. So HL7 version 2.5 was maybe the classic interop, software protocol for content. HL7 now is sponsoring FHIR. So I think we're making that transition, and it has the practical matter of letting a lot more people play in the healthcare game based on their skills and open source tools, right? So we're not talking about, you know, things that almost get to the black arts of programming that are, you know, very unique to healthcare skills. We're talking about, you know, things where a lot of folks can, you know, be contributors and provide offerings to the public.
Yeah, and I was looking at this, and it's not just for the consumer, although the consumer is a big part of this. There's you now support FHIR in bulk or bulk and FHIR. I'm not even sure what the acronym is, but it's going to give me the ability to move population health data around and be able to move clinically integrated network data around, which we always struggled with because our clinically integrated network, we didn't control the EHR, so we had many. If we were able to bring that data together, we could be able to look at the quality measures across that entire network, which was amazingly difficult prior to this. So there are mechanisms within this, not only for the consumer, but also as a foundational layer for interoperability between health systems, between providers and others.
Yes. So when I got into this in 2017 as coordinator and was, you know, doing research on what should be in the rule and how to advance these standards, right? Sort of the core coordination functions that ONC does. In talking with folks, in particular Ken Mandel at Boston Children's, it became clear to me that when we talked about FHIR and queries, there was something truly funny going on, which was that these queries only returned an N of 1. They were designed to return a single record. As somebody who's formerly studied database science, this is like, what? The query only returns one record? I mean, this was unfathomably primitive to, and so in talking with Ken, who had led the work on the Argonaut standard that made the initial, you know, query of 1, right, you know, getting the patient's record to communicate with an app, that all made perfect sense. We talked about what it would take to simply extend it, right? It's not a huge issue to extend this, given you've already represented the data in FHIR, right? The heavy lifting is already done. So this is the simple part of the iteration, arguably. At the same time, and we heard the same things, Bill, that you just described. We heard that payers, who are, you know, our agents in buying healthcare, can't actually get at electronic medical records any practical way to see what they're buying on our behalf, right? So they, you know, either you have to do bespoke one-off queries, I know that's redundant, or you have to do, you know, you have to get, you know, paper records, or you have to pay, we've heard reports that major payers had to pay EMR vendors $5 a pop to get the electronic medical record, you know, that they already had a legal title to because they were the payer, and you know, payers get to see the medical record. All of that is a very horrible way to buy healthcare. So we came up with, initially when I was talking with Ken, you know, just, I called it, well, you know, bulk FHIR, so that it's not an acronym. It was just a conversation I had with Ken. It always seemed a little inharmonious. We'd heard some suggestions to call it population level data. I tried doing that, but shorter words went out over longer words. So I think we're coalescing on bulk FHIR, though if I'd, you know, realized it was going to have legs, I probably would have thought about it and done it, named it something a little bit more tasteful. But the point of it is, as you point out, profound. So what bulk FHIR allows is that providers on their own, which often they've not been able to do, have an ability to get data out of their systems and use that for their purposes, big data analytics. It means that providers, payers, will be able to actually measure performance of providers and, you know, contract accordingly. Today, if you're a payer in the U.S., you to decide who's in network, the only real decision points are fundamentally three. One is, are they so big that you have to have them in your network because, they've consolidated that you don't have a choice effectively if you want to be in business? The second is, will they give you, a great price or a better price or, some price you can live with? And then the third is this somebody you want for reputational reasons? They're world famous. Notice in that list of three things, nowhere was there any actual discussion of bona fide measurable quality, right? Can you imagine in our consumer lives if we bought stuff without figuring out whether it was any good, right? Could you imagine going to a grocery store and buying food without some protections on safety? Could you imagine, buying anything without knowing as much as you can about the product? That's the way we've been in healthcare. And so what we've done as starting with the circa 2000, when Medicare went from any willing provider as a payment requirement to paying based on value, we've tried to come up with this very brittle proxy for value called quality measures. They're on very small sets of data. It's heavily lobbied. They're, lobbied to be, set the bar about a half inch above the ground on the provider side. They really don't add much, but at the moment, they're the only show in town here. In a big data world, if a payer has access to all the data, it is easy to use any machine learning algorithm and separate providers to whatever granularity of quality you want, whether that's quartiles, quintiles, deciles, whatever granularity you want, and it'll be way more reproducible than the current almost random measurement of quality. So I think you absolutely hit on the fact that if we have the APIs to make this doable, as opposed to a swamp of excuses, we're going to have a lot more potential accountability. And that accountability, of course, is not just on providers, but there's mirror symmetry that payers will have to actually figure out what they're doing to add value. It's very profound. It I think is important. It's modern, and it's, I think, what Congress was looking for when they said application programming interfaces without special effort.
Yeah. So one of the things, the next thing that people are going to talk about is the data, right? Because you've seen the EHR data, I've seen the EHR data, and it's kind of sloppy. So USCDI steps in, defines the data classes, defines the data elements, and gives a mechanism for future data sets and data elements as well.
Right.
Give us an idea of what people can expect up front from this, obviously within the 36-month time frame or the implementation period. Yeah. I think we ended up on 36 months, right?
Well, it's a bit nuanced. So the information blocking for the first 2 years, starting from month 6 to month 24, the information that needs to be released is U.S. core data for interoperability. So there's allowance for different formats for releasing that. What's called a content and manner exception. So what is the content you have to release, and then what is the manner you have to release it in? And the APIs, the U.S. core data for interoperability, that API kicks in 24 months after the rule posts, and then the broader data formats kick in at 36 months.
Great. So the clinical data. So the clinical data that's going to go across, is that the typical PAMI data, the problems, allergies, meds, immunizations?
Yeah, so the things that have been added there from the common core data set we've already had in our certification program are clinical notes and some provenance data and some better demographics for patient matching.
What do we have? So one of the big exciting things from where I sit is the insurance data actually flowing back and forth as well. So not only is it the insurance carriers can take a look at what the providers are doing, but the providers can now integrate in terms of research and other things, some of the insurance data.
Yeah.
But what insurance data, have we defined any insurance data that's going to be moving yet, or is that in the future?
Yeah, I think there's some early work at CMS with the blue button work, for the CMS data, but I think a lot of that is still a work in progress. The intent is to use as much, to use FHIR to do that, but there's still work to be done there.
Yeah, and no revenue cycle data yet. That will come at a future date, I would assume.
Yeah. Well, so the CMS rule, and we should really ask CMS about their role. I'm a little bit out of the bureaucratic swim lane, if you will, in talking about other agencies' rules. But obviously, there will be claims data there, so there will be a version of revenue cycle data. I think that the concept there is, in fact, that serves as a quality measure, because ideally the clinical data and the revenue cycle data should sort of match up, right, when you get right down to it. I wouldn't wait for that to, year one of the rule, but over time, it's not hard to imagine writing software to make sure that they match up and are in sync.
So let's, in our time here, I want to hit on practices. So some of the things we've seen over the years is EHR contracts, just contracts in general that house this data. They have certain NDAs, confidentiality agreements, hold harmless, just a whole bunch of stuff in them that essentially, that is the antithesis of, it doesn't allow us to share the data, and it doesn't allow us to get a clean view of the data. So we now have to address behaviors. We put the technology foundation in, but as we know in healthcare, the behaviors don't naturally follow because there's no financial incentives in a lot of cases to follow. So you really do have to put a stick in place. So there are, and I've interviewed entrepreneurs who refuse to go on the record because they don't want to get on the wrong side of EHR providers, but they say, hey, if I go into their app store, which is, hey, we have an app store, we're interoperable, they have to pay to access the data, they have to pay a fee for something else, and they have to essentially give away their intellectual property in order to participate in the app store. So this addresses a bunch of that as well to sort of level the playing field.
Yeah, so, we've heard multiple complaints about those behaviors as well. So for the U.S. core data, so first of all, our rule, the rule that we've just released, is for write-only rather than read-write into the EHR. That's a whole separate conversation. And the way there's a delicate balancing act here between accessing data, protecting the IP of the EHR vendors. I think there are a couple of sort of conceptual points that provide signposts here. So first of all, the biggest one is, other than an individual right of access, any other data access is covered by HIPAA. These are HIPAA covered entity business transactions. So all the big data, any use of the bulk API would be a HIPAA contracted transaction between a covered entity and a business associate or within the covered entity. So that has to be clear, because I think sometimes some of the people who don't want to share data sort of get very sloppy and claim, oh, all this data can be downloaded. That is, in fact, just simply untrue. But that's said by a lot of people because they'd like to say it. We've heard a number of complaints on API pricing schemes that have the effect of interfering with the access, exchange, and use of electronic health information, which is what's required under the Cures Act. So in order to address that, and you could argue, of course, that any fee interferes with that, right? I mean, by definition. But in order to balance the fact that any fee interferes with this but you need revenue streams to have these APIs. We've come up with, for these core APIs, for example, the API that a provider would need to buy from an EHR vendor to be able to give data to patients for free, right? So it's not free, it's embedded in the cost of healthcare. It's a cost of doing business, just the same way I have to buy a medical license. You know, turns out that's not tax deductible, whatever. There's lots of costs of doing business. That is a cost of doing business in a, you know, regulated world. So those APIs that support that access and that class of APIs have to be, you know, costs reasonably incurred, you know, with reasonable profit. That we've defined, which you can read in the rule, but amongst other things, it does not include give me all of your IP, and it has to be done on a non-biased fashion, so that you can't say to some app vendors, okay, with you we'll do business, but you know, some other app vendors, you know, we might want to be in this space in 2 years, so we're going to take your ideas, build out our own product, and not let you hook up. So it has to be on a the licensing has to be on a non-discriminatory basis. So that's that part of it. Now, if there are value add, if there are other business services, those things, you know, that go beyond the USCDI, those are whatever the market rates will bear. Our assumption is that over time, just the transparency and the visibility and into how to use these APIs and what their costs are, and just customer demand of EHR vendors will sort of bring this into something that's reasonable, even for the ones that are not protected under the Cures Act.
Yeah, and this is 21st Century Cures Act is interesting to me in that it really does. We talked about this the last time you were on the show. We talked about creating a market, and now we've essentially created a market for cures. We've created a market for experience. We've created a market for quality and accountability within healthcare, because we've opened up the data, which is the first step. It's the necessary step.
Yeah.
So what do you envision? Give me some ideas of the things you envision are going to come out of this as a result of this moving forward.
Yeah. You know, I think it's going to be a sequence of things, right? I mean, these things take a bit of time to learn. So I think as you look at the tranches of products that might come out, I think the initial ones will be, and there are already a number of them out there now, you know, from large companies like Apple to smaller companies like My Patient Links, Coral Health, Humetrics. You know, you're going to see initially versions of the electronic medical record. I think you're going to see explanations of what's there, what the tests were, what the services were, maybe interpreting the record. Over time, I think you'll see things that re-engineer care. I mean, right now, you know, chronic care, very episodic, but as we can instrument more of our bodies with all of this amazing technology, you know, we'll be able to tighten the feedback loop between treatment, you know, diagnosis via the smartphone and treatment, where some of these, you know, even if that's just pills, because we'll have tightened that loop a lot more. So rather than visiting your doctor or getting a blood test every so often, let's say there were tests that could hook up to the smartphone, or glucometers, which is the case today, or peak flow meters, or heart rate monitors. The Apple Watch would be a perfect example. All of a sudden, we're tightening up all of that. I think you're going to see an incredible mix of things. I think you're going to see not just from the president's executive order and the rulemaking that the administration is doing on price, but I think even just for market forces, you're going to see all of these things wrapped up with price as people can start shopping, right? Because if you don't post your prices and it's otherwise shoppable, People are going to go to where the lowest price is. That is America. We know that. You can ask Jeff Bezos if you have any doubt on how that might work. I think he can probably explain it to you. So I think there's going to be a lot of transformation. If you think about the Internet of Things, which I'm sure some of your audience has thought about in terms of healthcare, right? The smartphone is essentially our computer network in our homes on some level, right? So if you get the medical data, the smartphone, and then anything else you hook up to the smartphone, you create a much broader environment than just it's an app.
Yep.
So that's my sort of belief of what's going to play out here.
So last question, and I appreciate you giving us a couple extra minutes here. There's going to be laggards who step back and they say, well, we'll see what happens in the election. This will change just like other things will change if this administration gets moved out. But as we've talked before, this is the 21st Century Cures is bipartisan. And a lot of the work that's going on at ONC and HHS is just a continuation of work over decades. I mean, it's really been kind of consistent of moving in this direction. So the laggard doesn't get to sit back and say, this isn't moving forward. This is pretty solid. What would you say to those guys? Yeah,
look, the American public is unhappy would be an understatement with American healthcare. It screams out for transparency. It will happen one way or the other, no matter what the party is. The Cures Act rule is quite bipartisan. The Cures Act itself was voted almost unanimously. The work on information blocking was done in the prior administration. The law writing was done, with the work of a prior administration in both parties. As I think folks are quite aware, the president is extremely interested in having Americans being able to shop and control their health care. This is a center point of all of the executive orders, of all of the policy making, as well as creating markets and things like drugs to, have things to shop for. And frankly, I believe that will, that search for transparency is global. It is part of the age we live in. Maybe there's too much transparency sometimes, in social media, but it is a global phenomena. And I think people have to, providers, payers, economic parties here are going to have to, if they're working as most folks are on somewhat or highly non-transparent business models, they're going to have to really start thinking about what does my world look like when people can shop with information and control their destinies. What is going to be the mix of products? What's the mix of services? What's the mix of prices? I think it is, it has been dammed up for 50 years since, 55 years since Medicare started setting administrative prices, and arguably going back to 1942's Stabilization Act that made healthcare pre-tax. So we have had non-market prices now for pretty much everybody's adult lifetime, and pretty much everybody's entire lifetime if you go back to 1942. If we get market forces into healthcare, that will, unleash something truly amazing. It'll be great for the country because it'll make us more efficient and competitive. It'll allow real wage growth. Obviously, for those of us who are in the healthcare space, I think we're going to have to rethink some of our embedded assumptions.
Yeah. And with this show, I will post a bunch of links underneath. I think a lot of health systems are going to start doing their gap analysis they should have started 6 months ago because the writing was on the wall.
Well, if I can say one thing there, we have tried to make this rule from a provider point of view and even from a developer point of view be actually a very straightforward thing. I mean, if you think about, I know there's a lot of back and forth about all kinds of things, but ultimately what is required here is a database driver on whatever format you have as a database hooked up to a server endpoint, if you will, which obviously the EHR providers will presumably provide, though others could arguably provide it. And so you as a provider obviously have to maintain that endpoint and the IP address on the internet. But you're basically hooking up a server to the internet in terms of costs. This is something that I think is quite doable from a hassle point of view. This is not one of these things where we're touching 1,000 pieces of the system, frankly, like some of the things in meaningful use were, where, all kinds of behaviors have to change. Behaviors will change here, but they'll change because of market economics.
Yeah, it is. It's a FHIR server. It's a RESTFUL API. So
they're not going to change. They're not going to change because of, the rule says you have to change your behavior. You'll want to change because, there's that accountability.
Well, and I also think, anyway, we could keep going. I think there's a lot of benefits internally for an health IT organization. I think once they get past the initial shock, they're going to see great benefits.
All kinds of opportunities to rethink what they're doing, get smarter, better at it, actually control their own data. It's really the modern way to go. I mean, in healthcare, we've been the only sector of the economy that hasn't done this kind of stuff. Everybody else does this. I dare you to name an industry, a major industry in the U.S. where these kind of analytics and approaches aren't part of, common work. So it's going to be exciting. It's going to be good. It's going to be good for the public. I think, providers who are offering valuable services will be well rewarded.
Yeah, and if you were a CEO right now, you would be pulling your strategy people in and saying, look, we just got this thing just opened up. In the next couple of years, we're going to be able to provide a whole new set of services. So let's start brainstorming. What can we do? And yeah. Well, Don, thanks. Always great show. I really appreciate your time.
All right.
I'll post a bunch of links so you don't have to go through all the proposed rule stuff. Right. People can hit the episode and go from there. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right, Bill. Great. As always, great talking with you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, special thanks to Don Rucker and the team at ONC for making him available for the show. Really appreciate it. And as I said, I'm gonna put links on the page itself. So if you're listening to this in your car and whatever, when you get to the office, hit the page link, and it'll have a bunch of links to the ONC proposed rule, what's different from the proposed and the final rule, and a bunch of other things like that. Awesome. So don't forget to check back a couple times this week. We're going to be recording a bunch of shows. I have 2 more recordings going on later this afternoon. It's Tuesday afternoon of HIMSS Week. Tomorrow, I think I have 3 or 4 more interviews already scheduled. And that may not be all. So this week, that's what we're going to do. Next week, we go back to our normal schedule. We'll have Tuesday News Day, and then on Friday, we'll do industry influencer conversation. So this show is a production of This Week in Health IT. For more great content, you check out the website, thisweekhealth.com, or the YouTube channel as well. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.